Welcome to the discussion. My guests today are John Wilbur, a resident agent in charge at the Computer Forensic Laboratory at the NASA Office of the Inspector General, Zach Terwilliger, the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Scott Perry, the Special Agent in charge of Cyber Investigations and Technical Operations Division for the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General, and Lou Kias, the Executive Customer Advisor at Celebrate. Let me set some context for our panel today. Whether it's information technology or operational technology, few federal sectors have seen the explosion of data like federal law enforcement. From artificial intelligence to connected devices, federal law enforcement officers are facing the 3 V's of data: volume, variety, and velocity. This is why law enforcement officers need technology to keep up with all this data. They need to be able to access data wherever and whenever they need it. They need to manage data across organizations, both federal, state, local, tribal, and international levels. And they need to have the power to analyze the data on site. As nearly every agency and private sector organization has learned over the last decade, having the right data in the hands of the decision makers at the right time expedites decision making. All told, the requirement of digital intelligence is pushing many agencies to the brink of exhaustion. But through new AI tools and advanced analytics, law enforcement officers can find a way out of this maze of data. Some, like the Brennan Center for Justice, believe that technology and tools can provide a path to predictive law enforcement, using data to get ahead of potential crime by analyzing risk factors. Law enforcement officers need technologies that is integrated with existing tools and lets them collaborate with other departments or task forces to find connections among seemingly unconnected people, places, and events to resolve cases faster. And of course, none of this matters if the officers are not trained to use these technology and tools and handle digital evidence to build stronger cases. So how can all this be accomplished? Well, that's where all my guests come in. So gentlemen, I laid out the importance of data. It's not new here. We've heard this before, but maybe let me turn to Zach to start us off over at the Eastern District of Virginia, U.S. Attorney. Everything you do is probably data driven. Where do we start with the data? Discuss maybe how you're dealing with data, your data strategy, how to ensure both value and accessibility.
Thanks so much, Jason. I think it's a critical conversation, and I'm thrilled to be here with other panelists. Yeah, for us, it really falls into 2 streams. One, and I think that probably most people are aware of, is the data that are involved in our investigations. As Lou will be able to tell us, I mean, just 10 years ago, we had very limited information on cell phones. Now everybody's walking around, with a supercomputer, what would have been considered a supercomputer in their pocket. So when I first started doing this as an line assistant, as a prosecutor trying cases, you would get boxes of evidence. You'd have your physical evidence, you'd have your reports, you might have receipts, you might have a VHS tape from a robbery from the security camera. Now almost every case that we're involved in has terabytes and terabytes of data. Everything from the gang prosecution that we're doing, where 4 or 5 folks have cell phones and they're constantly changing them and they may be encrypted, all the way up to that white collar case now that originally would have a lot of emails, but now we're not even able to just get images. Now everyone is focused on metadata because you can derive intent based on the metadata behind it. So the biggest issue that we're facing in that first data stream I want to talk about is, what do you do when you have these investigations where the case file itself is multiple terabytes? Because as an investigator, as I'm sure my co-panelists will say, is the worst thing is you have everything and you don't know what you have. We also have ethical obligations. If you are accused of a crime, you are entitled to certain data under our discovery obligations. You're entitled to what the government's going to rely on to prove its case. You're entitled to any information that could be arguably exonerate you. It becomes incredibly difficult to both wade through that data, organize that data, understand that data, and then produce it. Just as an example, imagine you've got a case where there could be harm to victims and you've got terabytes and terabytes of data, and it's your job to make sure sensitive, personally identifying information doesn't get across the transom that could identify where these potential victims live or currently reside. It's a real challenge, and it's one in which we're using technology to the best of our ability to collect it, to analyze it, to store it, and then ultimately to produce it. And then secondly, very briefly, our other issue that we're using data on is, where do we use our finite resources? So whether it's heat mapping, whether it's crime intelligence, whether it's things even as advanced as shot detection technology that's telling us in certain cities where more shots are being fired on a particular block than another block. So For us, it's both the volume of investigative files that we prove our case with, as well as utilizing data to determine where do we need to use our finite resources.
Zach, you laid out the challenges. Let me ask you, what's your solution to those challenges? And I know that could take the rest of the panel, but give me maybe a high level view of how you guys are approaching maybe from a strategy perspective.
Sure, and I'll be brief. I think it falls into three buckets. You talked about the three V's. For us, it comes down to hardware, software, and personnel. So we're trying to get, with our limited budget, we're trying to get the best software we can in terms of how do we actually process this data. Some off the shelf, some that we're using custom coders on. Second, the hardware. Do we have truly the fastest computers that we can use right now? Do we have the computers that we need to process the terabytes and terabytes of data that we get in? And then the third is personnel. How in the government are we able to attract some of the best and brightest, knowing that we can't pay them as much, but knowing that we can't just rely on folks who sit passively by while a computer does its job. We need people who are critical thinkers, coders, and are actually moving the ball. So that's the way we've approached it thus far.
All right. Thank you for being brief. As I said, we could talk all day about it. Let me bring in John Wilbur from NASA. NASA, again, big data agency. We know that all this information is coming in, but you're looking at it from, again, the law enforcement side. What is your data strategy? How are you guys dealing with the three V's of data, if you will?
That's a great question, Jason. There's tremendous amounts of data, and currently there's no real way to have that data pared down or culled down without human intervention. So we hire very bright people that can separate out, hey, we know this stuff is not relevant. Here's the user-generated stuff, if that's what the focus of the case is, and be able to pare that down so that my end user is only have to wade through only what he has to or she has to find the evidence that they're looking for in the case.
That's a nice thought, right? Only what you need to, but as we heard Zach say, it's overwhelming, the amount of evidence. Are you guys looking at the strategy right now? Is there a way you're approaching data to say, again, obviously it's probably some similar combination of technology and people and process?
It's a combination. We do some where the software itself does some interpretation. Hey, was this item generated by the computer, by the system, or is this a user-generated item? And we try to parse that out first so that we can get the user-generated stuff to see what the suspects were doing, what were they generating. We do a lot in the fraud realm where people will make fake documents, make fake certificates of authenticity, fake compliance forms, and we'll find those under the user-generated documents where we'll see cuts and pastes and different versions of documents. But again, right now, that still relies on the human being, the analyst, to look at the data, wade through it, flag certain things, and then provide that to my end user, who's not usually a computer experienced person. They're a fraud agent. They know fraud, and in the past, that's what they've done. They've looked through boxes and boxes of paper, and now everything's on the computer.
I imagine that's going to be a theme. I want to talk to you later about that star I bought, and do I really own it? Who else? No, I'm just joking. Let me bring in Scott Perry from VA. Scott, again, another agency that really relies on data to make a lot of decisions and to drive a lot of the efforts to help veterans. You're, of course, bringing it from a law enforcement perspective. Let's talk about your data strategy, and again, this idea of the three V's, but also make it accessible.
And it is a big challenge. I think I'd like to start off by focusing on an external investigation where we went in and seized approximately 10 terabytes of data from a business that was defrauding the VA. And that is a lot to chew on. And that was a couple of years ago when we first got a collaborative web review platform where that did help, where agents, my examiners, would break the case down, the 10 terabytes down into smaller cases, smaller chewable chunks, and take out a lot of the operating system files, the hash sets that, okay, we know we don't want to look at this stuff. This is all executables, log files that we don't want to look at, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, this is a email and document case. So we can winnow the data down that way, present it on a web review platform for our agents to review, and then also bring in the U.S. Attorney's Office on another platform that we can exchange the files with. So everybody's looking at the same data, the same tags, the same keywords, and that really helped out in that case. That using techniques like that, the collaboration tools and the crosstalk and bringing teams of people really has helped out in the past with a lot of these large data sets. And it's a moving target. You know, the software changes, the way we access that software, better tools can become available. And the analytics, once again, has been brought up where the tools are getting smarter, but you have to have the smart people behind the keyboard to operate it, that understand how it works, understand what the U.S. Attorney's Office is looking for, what the investigator is looking for. And it's a team effort, especially nowadays. You can no longer process one computer, generate a tool report and just hand it over to an agent to present to the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's too much data. It's just too much going on. And you have to really know what they're looking for and give a finished product.
Yeah, I mean, I think Scott's 100% on. This is Zach at the U.S. Attorney's Office. One of the things that we've really had to work hard at, because we work with so many different entities, well, whether it's, you know, an Office of Inspector General, the FBI, ATF, DEA, a lot of those systems wouldn't talk to each other, or perhaps they didn't need to talk to each other, but they wouldn't talk with ours. And so one of the things we've tried to do is request information in one native form, such that so when we get it in, we can use whatever particular software program we're going to use to house and organize that data. So we're looking to things like load files. Okay, we need everything in its most native form. One, that way we can turn it over to defense counsel and they can do with it what they need. But also that way, if you've got multi-jurisdictional investigative teams, which almost every one of our cases have, you don't wind up with 5 databases. And just taking that that first step so that all the data eventually comes in one form has been critical for our ability to put together, you know, one robust electronic case package. But again, as Scott was saying, I mean, it's just, you know, the days of coming in. Originally, I think we were a little bit excited when we could mine the electronic data that was out there as law enforcement. But frankly, now you go into a house, we're really selective about what electronic data we want to take. Because if we take it, the expectation is, and it should be the expectation is, we're going to go into it using a search warrant, get that information, and then we're going to have to actually analyze it and pass it along. We can't simply say, well, we've got 10 computers and we've never looked at them. So now I've noticed the pendulum swing back a bit, is that when we go in, we say, we want to look at this particular computer, these particular devices, which we believe, you know, relate to the criminal conduct at hand or relate to this individual who's under investigation. You know, we don't want to look at a daughter or a son's iPad, you know, that's going to have their schoolwork on it, which is sort of a new development now that you walk into a house, and it's not uncommon to see, you know, 15 electronic devices in some of our white collar investigations.
Let me bring Lou into the discussion here. Lou, from your perspective at Cellebrite, what are you seeing? What are you hearing from your clients, your customers in the federal sector? We know there's a lot of data. We know it's a combination of tools, but what are some of the trends you're starting to see?
Yep, I'd go back to what John said a little bit earlier, just about the sheer volume of data that's out there. And do you have the personnel to sit down and look at thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of data? And in reality, most agencies don't have that type of resources. That's where the news technology comes in, where you can sit down and say, I'm looking for this specific information, be it a red truck or a gun. And as you're going through thousands of pieces of data, can you pick that out to be, which allows your agency to be more effective, more efficient, and be really more responsive in most of these cases? We're talking about major cases, especially at the federal level. So, I mean, and then the big concern I have for being in former law enforcement and working cases is when you're looking at years ago, when you just looked at boxes and boxes. And I remember telling my guys, why don't you pull all those boxes out? Let's go through each piece of paper one more time to make sure before we take it to the prosecutor that we've not missed anything. And that's always a major concern in these type of cases. I know Zach can tell you the last thing he wants to have happen is in the middle of a trial say, guess what we found? Or guess what we missed? And I think that's what's so important with this data. The other piece too, I think that's very important is it's probably very easy now to, well, not, I know it is, it's easy to gather this, what I call information, turn it into data, and then turn it into actionable intel. And the easy part is gathering the information. You can do that. But three things that I think that are very important. Is it timely? Is it reliable information? Isn't it actionable? And, just having a bunch of data doesn't mean a whole lot to an investigator if he can't do something with it. And I think that's one of the key points that when you're looking at this whole digital intelligence, you got to be very mindful of is, and I've seen agencies do it. They're so proud of all the data they have. And then I ask them, what are you doing with it? Well, we're going through everything. It just doesn't work. And, I guess, I think Zach brings up a very good point too, is really at the end of the day, the big question is, how do we share that data? Who do we share it with? That's always been a stumbling block. When I was with the Bureau, that was one of my main jobs, is trying to connect state and local law enforcement with with the FBI. How do we share that information? And if we're not sharing it, and if that's not part of our strategy, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later on, it has to be a major piece of it, because I believe John was saying, or maybe Scott, I think Scott was saying, nowadays in the environment that we work, and these gentlemen can correct me if I'm wrong, no one agency can take a case from soup to nuts. They involve, I know when I was at the Bureau, with DEA, ATF, U.S. Marshal, Postal Service, the VA. So you've got to be able to have a mechanism in place to share all of that quality data after you use this technology to create it into actionable intelligence. So I think that's very, very important. And one of the last things I'll say is one of my fellow panelists said about, you walk in now and everything's on somebody's smartphones. You can see that in what we're seeing in our country today. Everything is being videotaped, everything's being recorded. And last year we did a industry trend survey. Cellebrite did. Over 2,000 people participated in it. And one of the things we found across the board was most of them said 90% of the time a smartphone is involved in their investigation. That's not including computers and drones and Alexas and all those stuff. 90% of the investigation, there was an iPhone involved. And we all know the amount of data that can be on those iPhones. So as we go through this whole process, it's like trying to drink water out of a fire hose. And that sounds corny, but it's true. How do you get your arms around that? And that's a challenge for a lot of these executives that are trying to develop strategies and put safeguards in place to make sure that we don't miss something at the end of the day.
All right, there's a lot to dig out there, and we're going to do that in that next segment. So first, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the panel discussion, Managing and Maximizing Agency Data, sponsored by Cellebrite on Federal News Network.